There are three belts that leave the coast of Africa. There's one that's in the north, there's one in the middle, and there's one in the south. When you look at this middle one literally will take you right into the Gulf of Mexico, even if you didn't have power boat. And what's going to happen is the Africans are going to start to move into this area here, and they're going to begin to settle in this corner of the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to develop, according to what our research shows, three major cities: Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, okay, and La Venta.
If you go to Mexico, southern Mexico now, especially in the provinces and towns in southwest Mexico, they'll tell you there's two black people there: the ones that came on the ship, meaning those who were enslaved, and the ones who came before the ship, meaning those like the Olmecs and others who had been here at a point where no one knows when that genesis was. They just were always here.
The Olmec problem was that European scientists, after finding it, it was found by a little farmer who was clearing the land for him to grow some maize and grow his corn. And he found what looked like an upside-down pot. And when he called the owner of the land over, they found out what it was, and he excavated it, and they found this gigantic head. Now, that was back early in 1837 or 1897 or something around that time. When they found that and they saw this Africoid face, that completely turned everything around, because they thought the Mayan civilization was the oldest civilization here. Now, when they found that the Mayan civilization was not the oldest civilization, and that Africans all through the histories were supposedly brought here as slaves, they did not want to fess up and change their whole curriculum to state that there was an African civilization in the Americas some 5,000, 10,000 years ago. The other part of it is that during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the Vatican put out an edict very quietly that all Western books and academia had to first be passed through the Vatican census. So the Vatican said that any evidence of black history here had to be taken off of the history book. This man, Coe, who essentially became the top man that you went to see about Mesoamerican civilization, he worked for the CIA.
When I was down there in Mexico, I saw one Olmec statue. It was very interesting to me. It had the face of an African person, and the name of the statue was actually called Monkey Looking in the Sky. And what they would do, they would try to pretend that a lot of these statues were actually animals. Like the Olmec heads, they would try to say that they were jaguars or they were aliens from outer space. The European archaeologists would try to make up anything to say that they were not black. But this one statue called Monkey Looking in the Sky is clearly not a monkey, because first of all, monkeys don't have full lips, and it looks like a person. It is a person. And this just goes to show the depths that these archaeologists will go to deny the African history.
One of the earliest groups that I can find archaeologically would be the Folsom people, F-O-L-S-O-M. That's why you go out, you look at your map, you find various areas that we call the Folsom areas: Folsom, Arizona, Folsom, Nevada. You go out in New Mexico, you find Folsom Prison, and you find one of the biggest archaeological and oldest digs in America is called the Folsom Archaeological Findings out there, where they found all these African artifacts in the ground. And that was 16,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, Asians began to migrate across the Bering Straits into the United States, and they came into the United States across the Bering Straits into Canada, then down to the northern part of the United States, and down into the southern part, and they interbred and met and interbred with blacks, those Folsom people. And otherwise, that's why American Indians never had slant eyes and were never yellow skinned. They became round-eyed and brown skin and red skin.
All over the country of Costa Rica, you have these little African-like statues just all over the place. And when you go to the museums, you see these African artifacts, African-style gold, a lot of monuments and artifacts that resemble monuments and artifacts from West Africa.
You have one part of the Mississippi River go one way, the other part goes the other way. In the Y, of that split, you have a place that Native Americans call Cahokia. Today it's called Collinsville, Illinois. It's near St. Louis. This is where you have the largest pyramid in the Northern Hemisphere. It's called Monk's Mound.
If you look at pictures from the 1900s and beyond, most of the Native American people were very dark-skinned. Sometimes they were very jet black. But most Native American people before 1900, if you look at photos of them, they're extremely dark-skinned people, especially on the West Coast, like in California. The California Indians were very dark-skinned. The Indians that were around the Minnesota and Milwaukee area that we know as Milwaukee and Minnesota now, they were very dark-skinned people. The Native Americans on the East Coast were very dark-skinned people. In the late 1800s, there was something called the Dawes Rolls, which was basically a census that made records of people's ethnic backgrounds in order to determine which Native American tribes would get certain land allotments and other benefits. After slavery, many black people were associated with some of these tribes by bloodline, through marriage, through adoption, and even servitude. And because they were associated with these tribes, many black people were entitled to some of these benefits. The government did not want blacks to get these benefits, so they created a separate freedmen's list specifically for black people. They also started to list any full-blooded Native American who had African features as black because they didn't want them getting those benefits either. At the same time, they allowed white citizens to come in and pay money under the table to be listed as part Native American.
1895 and 1896, when a lot of the whites found out the benefits that these blacks are going to be entitled to, a lot of whites went to the Dawes Commission and say, look, why don't you put my name on there? They said, but you're not an Indian. So that's what they said, well, I'll give you $5. So the rule got around, the policy got around that for $5 that a white could put his name on the Dawes rolls and be called himself an Indian and be entitled to all these benefits, and all their children could be entitled to all these benefits forever. And so that became known as what's called a $5 Indian. And so if you go around now and check most of the Indians, the so-called Indians in America, about 90% of them are not even Indians. Those are just whites now who are passing as Indians. But they're getting all the benefits. And they're not paying any taxes, getting free college education. They put up a little reservation on the land that they don't live on. They have another home off and get all kind of benefits.
Iron Eyes Cody was another famous Native American person. He was in the media for years. In the 1970s, they utilized him for this pollution commercial. He was known as the Crying Indian. So he was a very well-known Native American in American culture. But the reality is, Iron Eyes Cody wasn't Native American at all. He was Sicilian. Both of his parents were from Sicily. So he didn't have one drop of Native American blood in him. He was another fake Indian. First authorized paintings from the Americas was of these 3 African men who were the leaders of a maroon colony down in Central America. And these men, the legend is that they were enslaved Africans who escaped, and they were shipwrecked, and they formed a maroon colony down in Central America, and they became leaders of the Native American tribes down in Central America. And this painting of these 3 African men, it's at a museum in Madrid, Spain today.
Boukman, Haitian Revolution, the original revolutionary, because he was turned in the night of the revolution. That's when Toussaint Louverture took over. The book Irritated Genie, we need to read. His name was Boukman. Boukman was called Boukman from Jamaica because he couldn't be handled in Jamaica. He was sold to Haiti. He started a rebellion amongst the African people. And they knew him as Boukman because they always read. He was very intelligent. He always taught the people who they were and what they were. The night before the revolution, Boukman looked to his brothers and sisters in the field. And he said, you want to win? Cast aside your white God. Embrace your African spirit. You are free. He didn't say you will be free. He didn't say you can be free. He didn't say you could be free. He said, cast aside your white God. You are free.
Had it not been for the Haitian Revolution, America would be 50% of its current size, if not more. The Louisiana Purchase doubled America's size, and there would have never been a Louisiana Purchase if there had never been a Boukman Dada, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Toussaint L'Ouverture, because it was their victory over Napoleon's army that bankrupted the banks of France and forced them to sell its shares of land in America to this country.
Toussaint Louverture gave millions of dollars to a man named Stephen Girard, who was a European sea captain, and Toussaint Louverture gave him this money to get arms because they were going to set up a colony in Africa to fight slavery. And when Toussaint Louverture went to prison, Stephen Girard would not return the money to Toussaint Louverture and his descendants and his family. So Stephen Girard took the money, the millions of dollars that he got from Toussaint Louverture, came to America, started Girard College, and he really became the first American millionaire. And so a lot of people don't know that Girard College was founded on stolen money from Toussaint Louverture. Down in Peru, they found a mummified body of a Peruvian girl who was sacrificed about 500 years ago. And the Peruvian girl, if you look at her, her body's well preserved. She has African features, African facial features. She even has African style braids. And this Peruvian mummified girl is still on display. The HMS Challenger was a ship that went on an expedition in the 1870s. And they went to different places around the world, and one of the places they went to was a place down in South America called Terra del Fuego. It's right on the tip of South America. And they took photographs of some of the Native American people there. And one of the Native Americans down there, one of the Native American pictures they took is a man who looks like a West African man. He's pure Native American though. And this picture of this Native American man who looks like a West African, this photograph is at the London Museum to this day. So this just goes to show many African-looking people were already over here.
Remember, when they attacked Africa, they did not attack Africa physically. They did not attack Africa educationally. They attacked Africa spiritually. Jomo Kenyatta said when the European first came to Africa, the Africans had the land and the white man had the Bible. White man told him to close his eyes, get on his knees and pray. Jomo said when the black man opened his eyes, the white man had the land and the black man had the Bible. We have bought into a story that we told them. They have twisted it. They got it twisted. We have now bought that story back.
What we call the African and the communities that that person lived in is where the concept of religion comes from. Europe never produced a religion, ever. Asia receives its religion from Africa. All of them. Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto. As a matter of fact, to be more scholarly, starts with Hinduism. The first Hindu gods to come across were black Africans. And they came across, they were called Sambo, which is now a derogatory term used for blacks, mulattoes, etc. Sambo.
I said Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are merely fragments from the periphery of the African spiritual system that you call voodoo. People say, you can't even go there with that. I can go there with that. And I can take on any theologian that you got, bring them down, and I'll show you. Give me your 12 tribes, give me your 12 disciples, give me your 99 pearls of faith of Islam, and I'll show you those are nothing but sets of qualities and attributes, and I can juxtapose them in a perpendicular line besides the Orishas of the Yoruba, besides the Loas of the Voodoo, besides the Netters of Egypt, and show you we're talking about the same system.
Jesus is a name which did not come into existence in the English form until the 1600s. The letter J was not invented until the 1600s. Let me say this again. Now, the letter J was not invented until the 1600s. So the reality is, Jesus is not the name of that person. His name is an Amharic name, Yeshua.
1482, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to paint a painting of Christ and the 12 disciples. This was 1482, 10 years before Columbus set sail, because that painting would be the greatest weapon used in colonialism, and still is right now, because many black people around the world still have that original Last Supper. And so when Leonardo was asked to paint that picture, he got his uncle to actually sit in, and this is an historic record. He got his uncle to sit in and pose as Christ, and he got 12 criminals from a local jail who happened to be available to sit in as the 12 disciples.
The only reason you call God by that name is because your former enslaver, your former oppressor, taught you that name. He never taught you the real name. He never gave you the keys to the power to free yourself spiritually, so that you are now spiritually or religiously still a slave.
The African population in North America is the third largest black population in the world in any geopolitical state. Why don't we have a single word out of one of our language for God that we use? The Arabs use their word for God. The Jews use their word for God. The Catholics use their word for God. The Japanese use their word for gods. The African is the only population that don't have an African word for God. Yet, studies coming out of Geneva over the last 30 years prove that we are the most spiritual people in the world, not just America. We worship with a greater propensity than any other people in the world, but we don't have a single word in our language for our divine.
The word Christ is a title. It's not a name. Christ means the anointed one. And there were many people before the birth of Jesus who also bore that title, Christ. There were 16 people who were known as Christ. So Jesus was the last of saviors of mankind, saviors of a group of people who were known as Christ.
When you talk about the image of Christ, it is important that we no longer ascribe to the European image of Christ. Why? Because the brain is an associating organism. It stores everything as pictures. And because it is associating, if you force feed an African child that Christ is white, because the brain associates, as that child begins to grow, the brain will associate white Christ with white people. And so if white Jesus is God, then white people must also be the gods of humanity. And so guess what? The power in the painting is transferred to the people who resemble that painting. And so it is difficult to pray to a white Jesus and not in some way feel inferior to white people. And that's why when I talk to Christian ministers, I often tell them you have to change these pictures. They say it don't matter. Of course it matters. Why do you think the European went around the world and systematically altered the image of Christ in every major cathedral, every major church, every corner of the globe? Because it is difficult to oppress a people whose image of the God doesn't look like the oppressor. But when God and the oppressor look one in the same, then the people will come to believe that the oppression was ordained by God.
What we find is that in this story that came out of Kemet, after Aset reconstituted the body of her husband Asar, the spirit of Asar came and impregnated his virgin wife, Aset. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to her son, Heru. And Heru was born 4,000 years ago on December the 25th.
So in 325, it was decided that Jesus Christ would be a son of God. In 325, it was decided that Jesus Christ would be born in the manger in Bethlehem. Up until the Nicene Council, most people believed that Jesus Christ was born in a cave in Ethiopia, even in Ethiopia till today.
Christmas was not celebrated in December 25th. For hundreds of years. It was celebrated in August. They move it to December 25th because that's the Egyptian celebration of the birth of the son of the sun. Talking about Heru and Asa.
The image that we have of Santa Claus is the rosy-cheeked European jolly guy, and that image was created sometime in the early 1800s. But the real Santa Claus was a man by the name of St. Nicholas. And when I do research about St. Nicholas, the real St. Nicholas, the further back I go, the blacker St. Nicholas gets. And when you look at pictures and portraits of St. Nicholas in museums in Europe, St. Nicholas is totally black. And there's a museum in Italy that has an old painting of St. Nicholas, and he has like dark skin, woolly hair. So people have to realize that the Santa Claus that we know and love today is based on a black saint from Europe.
The Council of Nicaea was an effort by Constantine to control the people through military and through religion. Whoever can control your concept of God has a weapon more powerful than any physical weapon, than any sword, any gun, any atomic weapon. Whoever controls how you relate to the unseen presence of God will not only control you, but can control your children and your children's children. So it was at the Council of Nicaea that the Constantine, this emperor, needed to find a way to consolidate his power, because the people that he conquered in various parts of the world had different religions, different ideologies. And it was at Nicaea where he brought together these theologians, these scholars, if you will, to hammer out one uniform theology that everyone would follow.
And if Constantine could convince people to take Jesus as God on earth and change that he was a human being, then they could take over the control of the Catholic Church and make one. So they invited. And one of the priests was an African known as Arius, Bishop Arius. There's a book called Blacks Who Died for Jesus by Mark Hyman. Gives the story of Arius. Arius now gets word that Constantine knows Arius is coming to dispute this. Because he's saying, how are you going to tell people this? Nobody's going to believe that story. That Immaculate Conception? Come on, we know that's written on the walls of Egypt. That's a mythology, that's an analogy. You're not supposed to believe that story. That's a nice story to live by, that each and every one of us has Jesus within us and every birth is an Immaculate Conception. But there was no one boy born as the Son of God to free. Come on, you can't. Constantine said, look, come on over here, Nicaea, I'm going to talk to you. He found out that he was going to be assassinated. So he fled into Europe with his followers. Arius and his followers became known as the Aryans. Wouldn't Hitler have a heart attack if he knew who the real Aryans were? They were a bunch of black folk.
Everybody who was worshiping Isis and dealing with mostly a Kemetic religious philosophy, they said, we can't do this. This is ridiculous. This reminds me, there's no man called Jesus Christ. We ain't never heard of him. Well, Jesus Christ will take Jesus, which was the sun god in the West, and we'll take Christos, which was the sun god in the East, and we'll put them together. We'll have a name. And so what did he do? A man named Apollonius of Tyana, at that time, who had studied philosophy in Kemet, was teaching. He was a healer, working miracles. He was a hero at that time. So he became the template for Jesus Christ.
The first slave ship, the first ship that was used to bring Africans from the continent and transport them across the Americas, was known as the good ship Jesus. And as Alex Haley said when he did his research for Roots, he said that traditionally, when Africans were loaded on the slave ships, the captain in his log would see to it that the first two people loaded aboard those slave ships were a man and a woman, and they were recorded in the ship's log as Adam and Eve.
The African priests were always smarter than the European thief. Always remember that. The thief is never smarter than the one he or she is taking from. The one he or she is taking from is a superior being. That's why you're stealing. This is the whole point to why you're taking, because what we got, you ain't got.
And in the case of King James, I believe it was 1604 when he initiated, 1604, 1609, when he commissioned a group of 50 men to pull together all of the references, all of the biblical references in existence. And one of the men who, it is said, participated in this project was the most prolific writer of the English language at that time, a young poet by the name of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare did work on that project, but as with many religious works that were commissioned during that era, none of the authors were allowed to put their signatures on their works. So artists, being the creative people that they are, found creative ways of putting their signatures. In Psalms 46, verse 3, and Psalms 46, verse 9. The 46th word from the beginning of Psalms 46 is the word shake. The 46th word from the end of Psalms 46, 9 is the word spear, Shakespeare's name. Now, if you look at other versions of the Bible, not the King James Version, but other versions of the Bible, you won't find that same correlation, only in the King James Version.
We are so far removed from the reality of our African spirituality. And until we cast aside that white God, we can't be free.
There's a war of genocide that the ignorance of Europe and Asia is allowing them, for the sake of trying not to be faced with genetic annihilation, has allowed them to concoct ways of murdering us. I mean, we can go to the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee, or we can go to the AIDS in Africa. I mean, look at this thing in Africa. There was we got AIDS, and so everybody in Africa, all of a sudden, some of the first we saw popped up in New York City in the homosexual community, now it pops up in Africa, and tens of millions of people have got it, and the pharmaceutical company is going crazy selling them drugs that they have to stay on for perpetuity. Billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, you are guaranteed, because all these Africans have to take this medicine for the rest of their life. Give me a break. You tell me the guy who enslaved me, the guy who practiced colonialism against me, the guy who raped my mama, my sister, cut the testicles off my father, ripped me apart with horses, all of a sudden is gonna come to my well-being and make me a medicine that's good for me, when his whole history is about profit and genocide at any cost, even if it meant killing his mother. And I'm not just talking about our European brothers and sisters as regards dealing with the black brothers and sisters. If you just read books on the Inquisition and the horror and the genocide waged against European working people and the women of Europe is so horrific, it makes even the transatlantic slave trade looks pale sometimes.
The whole AIDS hoax has been about us getting to take the medication. There's no HIV that creates AIDS. They found that the HIV is a very innocuous, very benign so-called virus and doesn't cause anything. What does cause AIDS is drugs, the taking of medications. And what created the AIDS condition in the homosexual community that came, what is known as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, were these poppers, amyl nitrate and butyl nitrate, these things that were used for the heart to dilate the muscles. Well, the homosexual community, the one who created it into these little popping things, when you broke the seal, it made a pop, so they call them poppers. It was the inhalation of these things that began to bring down the so-called immune system of the homosexuals, and they began to have this immunodeficiency based upon overuse of this. Why did they use these poppers? because when they used these poppers and they inhaled it, not only did they get the rush, but the anus began to dilate and relax. So the homosexuals were using this left and right. Thousands are being sold here in New York. And when they found that, they did not put in that poppers were the ones, and that drugs and these poisonous medications were creating the conditions called AIDS. They took the opportunity to ride the HIV/AIDS connection because they knew the money that would be made and that they could recruit people into believing that a heinous disease had attacked everybody. And where did it come from? Africa.
It's always wise to study your enemy. If you're going to defeat someone, you must know their strengths and their weaknesses.
People have been utilizing Africans to heal themselves for centuries. And people have been going to African shamans, African witch doctors to find cures for themselves, that Eastern medicine. So people have been going to African people to cure themselves for years.
The doctor that's given credit for a lot of the internal examinations that women go through, those instruments were first tested on women who were enslaved. And I can only imagine, well, I can't even imagine. A woman could imagine. But the kind of pain that that woman was put through to test those particular iron, steel objects that would go up through their bodies.
In the United States, what they would do with slave children, and this has been well documented, to cure rheumatism and to cure gout and to cure arthritis, they would place their feet on top of a slave child and just keep their feet there for hours, thinking that the child, the melanin, would draw out whatever sickness the slave masters would have.
Well, we know that a lot of things have happened in our hospitals. We know that experiments was used on our people in almost every city hospital in America.
Henrietta Lacks was a sister who lived in Baltimore and who had cervical cancer, and ultimately died of cervical cancer. And the doctors harvested some of her cells, and what they discovered in performing tests on her cells were that her cells were immune to specific diseases, specific cancers. So there was a quality in her cells that was resistant to disease. And they began to develop a host of vaccines and treatment modalities using the cells of this black woman, and they never told her family that they had harvested her cells, that they had made millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars.
Henrietta Lacks' own DNA and her cells are all over the world right now because they were so prolific, they just kept on multiplying. That was an indication of the fact that as African peoples, we hold the genetics for eternal youth.
There's a book called Acres of Skin that talks about the experiments that was done on black men in Philadelphia prisons from the 1950s to the 1970s.
In addition to the many medical experiments that are done on blacks in hospitals and prisons around the country, many people believe that chemtrails that are often seen over black communities purposely contain chemicals that create adverse reactions within the black community.
The chemtrails are dangerous because of what they contain: barium, strontium, and genetically altered red blood cells. What are genetically altered red blood cells doing in an aerosol?
And if you go to Harvard, they have a place on the campus, one of the tallest buildings on Harvard University is called the Herbarium. The Herbarium. In there, every floor is dedicated to some parts of Africa and Asia, and mostly Africa, where the young scholars who are working on their PhD is sent to study the fauna and the herbs and the plants of these places, and to interview the so-called healers and witch doctors, and come back to Harvard and tell what medicine, what medicinal purposes these herbs, fauna, and plants are used for, and then they create synthetic versions of it and sell that formula to the pharmaceutical companies.
There's a drug epidemic in a neighborhood, and the hospital is quiet. Forget law enforcement for a minute. The hospital, this is the center of the community's health. and the hospital is quiet. So we're in a situation where the institutions by which we live are conspiring against us. There's no such thing as an institution that is standing with its lights on and people going in and out of the institution, and you're still not receiving the service of the institution. How is that possible that there is a standing hospital in most neighborhoods and everyone's sick? How is it possible that there is a police department in every neighborhood, several, and crime is still what it is? How is it possible that there is a public school and people are dumber? I argue conspiracy.
The black community is really the only community that's really afraid of hospitals. If you go around the country and talk to different African American people, they have horror stories about certain hospitals within the neighborhoods. Out here in Los Angeles, you have a hospital called King Drew Medical Center. Well, it was closed down, but they had a hospital called the King Drew Medical Center. And if you ask any black person in Los Angeles, they say, well, that's Killer King Hospital. It was known for people going in there for minor ailments and not coming out. And there were all types of rumors about King Drew Medical Center. Some people said they were selling organs, they were killing black people, selling off their body parts. There was a story in the LA Times talking about how people were so afraid to go to the King Drew Medical Center that if they got injured, they would run from the ambulance if they knew the ambulance was going to take them to the King Drew Medical Center. So that type of reputation has been going on in the black community for years about certain hospitals in the area.
It is very difficult to use black people to experiment and find out cures because of melanin. That's why, experimentally, doctors and Europeans use white mice. They use albinoid mice because the outcome after you go into a white mouse is what's going to happen to a white person. If you use brown and black mice, the outcome is not going to be for white people because a black and brown mice is a melanated mouse. A white mouse is an albinoid. That's why they got pink eyes.
Melanin is an alkaloid. The chemical structure of melanin is an alkaloid, and it is similar to the chemical structure of other alkaloids, which are heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. And the other important aspect of this is because of the fact that melanin is an alkaloid, it binds to other alkaloids. So black folk who smoke crack or do cocaine, heroin, or marijuana are inclined to get higher faster and have a more intense high because of the alkaloid in the melanin binds to the alkaloid in that drug, which consequently means that people of African ancestry are going to become addicted faster and have a more difficult time trying to kick those drugs.
It wasn't just crack cocaine that came into the black and Latino areas. It was a way of life that came into the areas that replaced another way of life. Let me go back a little bit. Just before the crack cocaine way of life, you had the cocaine way of life. You know, not to call any names, but the pinnacle is Studio 54, where you know, this 70s New York City nightlife, where cocaine is everywhere and flagrant. In rap music, in early MC and DJing, you get MCs on the mic saying cocaine, cocaine. Somebody say blow, blow. All of that kind of stuff. Early parties. Before that, I'm talking just now 77, 76. Before that, go back 75, 74, 73. Heroin was the lifestyle that was pushed onto the black and Latino community. Each one of these destructive lifestyles were introduced into the community.
The youth in the country in the 60s almost brought us to the democracy we say we are. And the tyranny that rules our country by controlling the economy of this country decide to bring drugs and then use the war on drugs to create laws like the 3 strikes and you out and the Rockefeller laws that are as worse as any we saw in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist period to put the young people in prison, many of them for the rest of their lives, for crimes that normally you would have walked after a year or two.
The 13th Amendment reads, slavery is abolished except when you are found guilty of a crime and go to jail. So prison is the slave plantation. And look at all the things that are denied you in jail is the same thing that were denied Africans on the plantation. Slavery still is very much alive.
Today, there are more African American adults under correctional control in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. Crime and crime rates did not drive mass incarceration to begin with. Incarceration rates have fluctuated over the years, gone up, gone down. Today, are actually at historical lows, but incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have consistently soared regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. War on drugs, which has been a major engine of mass incarceration, has targeted poor communities of color, especially black and brown men, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than white.
Before 1964, the prison rate in America, the majority of people in prison were white people, were white guys. But the thing is, there was no need to have a strong police presence in the black community because black people were already controlled by the basic laws of the land. Black people were already controlled by Jim Crow laws, signs saying black people drink from this water fountain, black people couldn't live in this neighborhood. So black people were just controlled, period, at that time. Now, after the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964, this is when the police presence became very strong in the black community, because the average citizen couldn't control black people like they could before then. So they came up with another strategy and had law enforcement do it. So around 1964-65, black communities were flooded with law enforcement. And this is why the Black Panthers was started, because of the police brutality that had started in the black community.
Prisoners themselves represent a small percentage of the population under correctional control. Like today, there's about 7.6 million people under correctional control, but only about 1.3 million are in prison of that. The rest are on probation, parole, in jail, overwhelmingly for minor nonviolent offenses and drug offenses. The problem is that even if you don't get prison time, even if you're lucky enough to get just felony probation, you're saddled for the rest of your life with a felony record. And so the question isn't, in my view, just who's in prison. The question is, who is branded a criminal or felon and must live with that label for the rest of their lives.
The people said, well, if we don't need black labor anymore, what do we do with it? Well, we have to set up a system in the commercial system, or at least incorporate black people into the commercial system so that they make us money without having to do the labor of kicking cotton or picking sugar cane or whatever. We already passed that. So how do we make a more sophisticated plantation where we can keep slaves? Well, let's criminalize pretty much every damn thing that we do. There are over 1 million laws on the books now. Who needs 1 million laws? Unless you want to control people's behavior.
The police presence has always been in the black community because we are prisoners of war. That's number one. The original police were created to catch slaves. They were slave catchers. There was no need to police a white society. There was no need for that in early America. There was no need for that. Police even became wild when police were always about guarding property. That's what the police are about, guarding property. That's it. their job gets stretched out to a moral responsibility and public safety and that kind of thing later on in their development. But the original concept of a police officer is to make sure your property stays with you. They are hired by the rich, first of all, to protect the rich's property.
People of all races who are jobless, especially chronically jobless, are more likely to be violent than those who are not. And ghettoized communities are areas of concentrated poverty and joblessness. So it's not a surprise that there are higher rates of violent crime, and this idea that there's something especially wrong with black men that makes them more likely to be violent, or especially wrong with black culture that leads to high rates of violence, is just disproved by all of the available evidence. If we were to invest in education and job creation in the communities that need it most and eradicate these high levels of joblessness, we would also see the racial disparity in violent crime disappear.
A lot of people don't know the original street gangs in America were European immigrants, and the movie Gangs of New York goes into that, how these Europeans came over and they formed the first street gangs in America. And the thing is, they weren't demonized.
There was a wave of white crime, where white immigrants coming to the United States who were jobless and poor were engaging in high rates of crime. But the response wasn't, let's lock them all up and throw away the key. The response was, what can we do to save our young men? And they went in and invested in education and job creation and providing social services and a safety net to ensure that these young men did not slip through the cracks, and viewed them as one of us who need to be protected and saved, whereas young black men in ghettoized communities are viewed today as largely disposable.
80% of prisons are found in Republican districts, because you may have a town of, let's say, 20,000 people. Let's say you have 20,000 prisoners in the prison in your community. When it's time to be taxed, when it's time to get money from the government, you have 40,000 people. And even though those other 20,000 never get money that are in prison, they're accounted for in your population.
There's extraordinary amount of money being made off of mass incarceration today. I mean, part of it is private prisons, which are making their money, from caging human beings quite directly, but there's also a range of other private corporate interests that are profiting from the prison industry today. Private phone companies that charge prisoners and their families exorbitant rates just to place phone calls and remain in touch with loved ones. Taser gun manufacturers, private health care providers that provide typically abysmal health care to people behind bars, have secured very lucrative contracts, and then, there's private corporations that are now using prison labor, rather than shipping jobs overseas, are actually using prison labor, paying them far less than minimum wage.
Many of these furnitures we see in all the state offices and stuff, they're made by brothers and sisters in prison. They try to make it seem like it's just license plate. It's a lot more than that. Then all of them are located in areas where they're farms, and almost all of them are loaned out to work these farms, where they're getting only pennies a day. Slavery.
Many of these agencies get rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept in for drug offenses, which helps to explain why so many law enforcement agencies go out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible in the hopes of boosting their numbers up and continuing to qualify for funding.
Anytime you can put your prison on the stock market, it means you already have a methodology to guarantee the commodity, and the commodity is the imprisoned young black man and woman.
You're given a number, and you're warehoused in this cell, and you become a warehouse receipt. So more jails are kept up because the warehouse receipts, and if you don't have anybody in jail, you're not making any money. So you need to keep the jails filled in order for those warehouse receipts to be traded on Wall Street and the insurance companies to be making money each time.
Drug markets, much like American society generally, are fairly segregated by race. Black folks typically sell to black folks, Latinos to each other. Drug markets are even segregated by class. You know, university students sell to each other. You know, drug dealing happens in every community of all colors, but those who do time for drug crime are overwhelmingly black and brown. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan, really, who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And he declared his drug war in 1982, actually a couple of years before crack first began to ravage inner city communities and become a media sensation. The media frenzy around crack cocaine didn't just happen, it was actually part of, you know, a political campaign conducted by the Reagan administration to sensationalize crack use in inner city communities to boost public support for a drug war they had already declared and persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. After crack became a media sensation, harsh mandatory minimum sentences started sailing through Congress, you know, harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug offenses, sentences larger than murderers receive in many other Western democracies. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them, those people, than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who actually escalated the drug war far beyond what Reagan and his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible.
There was a representative in Missouri named Chuck Graham, and he had a proposal. He had something called the Life for Life program. And with this program, they wanted to offer prisoners on death row lighter sentences if they were to donate one of their organs or body parts.
Well, the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were anxious about or resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. And President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, Haldeman, described the strategy this way, and I believe I'm recalling the quote correctly. He said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. The meth epidemic has been severe, and you know, some have argued that the meth epidemic is actually far worse than what the crack epidemic was in terms of the harm that it caused. But you know, there hasn't been any media frenzy associated with the meth epidemic. There has been an increase in the number of whites going to prison for drug offenses since the meth epidemic, but there hasn't been an all-out war waged against, you know, people who are predominantly white, who use and sell meth. It doesn't matter how severe the racial disparities are, unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias tantamount to an admission of racial bias by a law enforcement official. You can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today, which presents a bit of a challenge since most law enforcement officials, like the rest of us, know better than to state our racial biases out loud. A police officer isn't going to say, "Yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was, well, because he was black."
People look at it as a civil rights violation, but it's really a human rights violation because it's criminal what they're doing to black people on a mass scale, criminalizing the image of black people and railroading them into a jail system really for profit. That's slavery, and that's a human rights issue, and black people need to start treating that as a human rights issue. So we shouldn't go to the courts here because the courts here are in cahoots with the private organizations that's railroading all of these black men into the prison system. So if black people are going to do anything, they need to take this fight to the world court, to the world stage.
Well, I do think mass incarceration is a human rights issue, a human rights crisis. And there have been efforts to bring these issues to the United Nations and to international courts. And I think we should continue to do so. I do think we should avail ourselves of those tribunals and make more of an effort to educate people in other countries about the realities of what is going on in the United States. So many people around the world today think that the U.S. is the land of great racial equality, especially with the election of Barack Obama, and it's important for the other story to be told.
At the time, you know, we had just come back from Vietnam, and there was a threat, King David and King Alfred plan, because of the blacks. And remember, it was mostly blacks that were fighting in the end in Vietnam. And they feared, at least this is my conjecture, they feared that these soldiers who were coming back home with the knowledge of warfare and all the tactics that they learned about the Europeans and warfare were to be used on them. The King Alfred plan was to make sure that they would round up people into concentration camps the way they did with the Japanese, the internment camps, as well as to shut down areas, grids of electricity in the areas where blacks were consolidated. Also to place bombs, most people don't know, to place impediments or areas, or to set up roadblocks, or to cordon off whole communities.
Freeway systems in black areas are designed to really regulate the community. For example, out here in Los Angeles, South Central LA is really surrounded by 4 freeways. It's surrounded by the 10 freeway, the 110, the 405 freeway, and the 105 freeway. During the LA riots in 1992, a lot of people don't know that they actually shut the freeways down, and they were going to start bringing in the National Guard, where they actually did bring in the National Guard. So the black community, they always have freeway systems there because they never know when they need to implement that King Alfred plan, when they need to go in there with military tanks, if there's some racial insurrection, and really suppress the black community. So that's one of the reasons for the freeway systems being directly on top of the black communities around the country.
And every black community in America got expressways that went right through them, destroyed them. If you want to find out where the old black communities used to be, go in the city and find the expressways. There's a direct relationship between having the businesses and being in prison. Go find see how many Asians you can find in American prisons. They ain't gonna be in there. But 51% of your prisoners will be black because blacks don't have any businesses and industries. There's a direct link. Blacks won't practice group economics. Blacks won't practice group politics. If you don't practice, you're setting yourself up. I told that 5-story building, you're setting yourself to get wiped out. Understand the nature of race, which is economics. If you build the first floor, it's economic. Build your businesses and your industries. Control business and industry, and put that pools in your money, and hold that money, and practice group economics with it. Arab and Asian money bounces